Hello again. So now we're moving on to biblical history. Ralph, what was the Ark of the Covenant?
Yeah, the famous Ark. The famous Ark was just a box. They were very common in Egypt. And if you want to know exactly what the Ark of the Covenant looked like, then you go to the Cairo Museum and have a look at the Ark of Tutankhamun, and it's exactly the same. It's a slightly different dimension, but it's exactly the same as the biblical Ark of the Covenant. And it even has the bronze rings underneath it for the carrying poles. And these were arks which carried, some of them carried the images of the gods, because the gods were paraded around the cities and up and down between the temples, very much the same as they used to be in Catholic circles. I'm not sure if they do this very much anymore. But anyway, when I was younger and going around Italy, you would see these big parades with the image of the god, which would normally be, Mary the Mother or something like that, being paraded around the city on a platform held by, a dozen people. And that's exactly what they did with the Ark of the Covenant. And that's exactly what they did with the Egyptian arks as well. They carried the image of the god from temple to temple. And it's quite obvious within the tomb of Tutankhamun that they had many of these arks were also for carrying important documents as well. And possibly even the treasury of the kings as well. So it'd be full of whatever they were using as money in those days, pieces of gold and silver. And so they were quite important, whether it was holding the image of the god or important documents, they were quite important. And one of the things that they carried, by the looks of it, was a sacred stone. Well, very much as it says in the Old Testament as well, two sacred stones which held the Ten Commandments. But the sacred stone I'm thinking about is the omphalos, which when it went to Syria was called the Elagabal. And the interesting thing is when the Elagabal went to Odessa, that city again, the city of the Kings of Odessa, of the biblical Jesus, when it went to Odessa, the Elagabal was always in a box. And the box looks exactly like you would imagine the Ark of the Covenant to be. It looks exactly the same as the Ark of Tutankhamun. And it obviously wasn't too heavy because you can see it with small feet underneath it. And you can also see it sitting on a cart, a four-wheeled cart with this box. And therefore it was known as a Bethel, which is why sometimes you hear the stones being called a Bethel, but they're not really a Bethel. A Bethel is a house of God. And it refers more to the box than it does to the sacred stone that was inside it. And so the Ark of the Covenant was a Bethel, and it held the sacred stone. And that's why in the New Testament, of course, the primary disciple of Jesus was called Simon Peter. And he was given the title Peter because he was the keeper of the stone. Because these stones were important to these various sects, whether they were in Egypt or in Greece or in the Near East, and the gospel story. There was always an element of this sacred stone that has traveled through history and used to be carried within the Ark of the Covenant.
Great, Ralph. So the Ethiopians have claimed for a long time that they've had the Ark. Is there any truth to that at all? Do you know?
Well, the Ark that they actually displayed was not a box. It was two tablets that were shaped into the tablets that carried the Ten Commandments. And they were made of wood. They weren't even stone. And so the Ethiopian Ark is not the Ark as we would understand it. It's more the contents of the Ark. I mean, there was a a history that the ark went missing when. Let me think about this. It went missing, I think, just during the Babylonian invasion, and there was a theory that it had been taken by the Queen of Sheba, or the son of the Queen of Sheba, who was called Menelik, and taken back down to Ethiopia. I think that's the story from the Kebra Nagast, which is the Ethiopian Bible. There's not much evidence to support that, although, of course, the Ark of the Covenant would have disappeared by the time of the Babylonian invasion, because the temple was destroyed at that time, so it must have been smuggled away somewhere. But there is no particular evidence that it ever went down to Ethiopia. And, of course, the Odessans claim that they had it in the 2nd century AD.
Yeah. Is the Big Ben bell the Elagabal stone?
The Big Ben. Big Ben is the bell inside the clock tower on the Houses of Parliament in London, and it's called Big Ben, and it's bell shaped, of course, because it's a bell. It's a very large bell in a tower. It just struck me that it has the same symbolism and the same name as the original Ben stone in Egypt, which was at Heliopolis. And the Ben stone was supposed to be on a large stela, so a large pillar, which had this sacred stone, the omphalos, the Elagabal, which at that time was known as the Ben. And yeah, the Ben has a long history. It was supposed to be the first piece of ground that appeared from the chaos of Nu, the cosmos. The cosmos was the waters of Nu, and this was the first piece of ground that appeared. So during the sort of flood type mythology of Noah. And so it was held, this sacred stone, which was probably a meteor, was held at Heliopolis, and its name was the Ben. But of course, in Egyptian, a duplication just means big. So they didn't have a word for big. You didn't say the big stone. You said the stone, which meant the big stone. And so the Ben means the Big Ben. It has the same name as the Westminster Bell. And of course, it was a bell-shaped stone. The images we have of it is of a conical stone, which was actually not that big. It was probably only about 60 centimeters, 80 centimeters tall, so less than 3 feet. So it was a relatively small stone, but it was probably made of metal. It was probably an iron-rich meteorite, in which case it may well have rung like a bell. You could probably hit it and it would ring like a bell. So it's possible that the earliest bell was the Ben stone, and it was a conical bell called the Ben. And of course, in Westminster, we have a conical bell that's called the Big Ben, the Ben. It's just there is no evidence that anyone saw that symbolism, but it's an interesting connection anyway.
Yes, very much so. And we've also got the Holy Grail stone in a James Bond movie.
Yes, the very same stone.
Yep.
So we have this history, which I'd been following, of this ancient stone, which, as I say, is a meteorite. And it's envisaged either as a conical stone, or if you take it out of its housing, it's a bit like a lingam. If you look at an Indian lingam, it looks conical, but if you take it out of its housing, it's actually egg-shaped. So it has a base to it as well. And the Elagabal, the Ben, might have been the same sort of shape. And it was a meteorite. So as I say before, it might have been metallic. And I'd been researching this for several years, and so I knew very much what it looked like, because we have images from Rome and from Syria that show us what it looks like. And then I was watching this James Bond film. I can't remember what it's called, actually, which Bond film it is. Anyway, they were running around North Africa for some reason, and they got captured and they were taken to this big crater, which is in North Africa. It's a real place, but it's not a crater. It's actually, I think it is an eroded piece of land, or it might be an extinct volcano, but I think it's just eroded. So you have this big circle that looks like a crater. And they had this, the evil enemy had his headquarters in this big crater. And they were taken into this room, and inside the room, there was the Elagabal just sitting there. And it really had no particular relevance to the rest of the story. Suddenly they were confronted by this meteorite, which was supposed to be the oldest, piece of rock in the world. And some little speech was given about why this meteorite was important. But it happened to look exactly as we know the Elagabal, the Omphalos, actually looked like. And it was just sitting there in this Bond movie. So I don't know, perhaps one of the directors, producers of the Bond movies, a fan of my books or something, I don't know. But anyway, somehow I'm pretty sure they must have cottoned on to the story of the Elagabal, because there are not many meteorites that look like the Elagabal. And just to have it in the middle of this film was a bit incongruous, to say the least.
Crazy stuff. Okay, so let's move on to what was the Star of Bethlehem?
Yeah, the Star of Bethlehem. These, again, a topic that's been mulled over on many occasions, and many people have different ideas. But we know it wasn't the star in the east in the normal fashion, because otherwise the Magi would have gone in the opposite direction. They'd have ended up in India if they were following the star in the east. The Magi came from Persia, so they must have been following a western star to get to Judea rather than the eastern star. What I think it's talking about is the star prophecy was about a new era, and this would be an era that would be governed by a Judaic king, a king from the east. And that Judaic king was going to be Jesus. It was Jesus who was born under the Eastern Star. And so the star prophecy, which was running around in the mid-first century, was all about the birth and the coronation of the Jesus character. But what did it mean at his actual birth? Well, I think it actually meant the procession of the equinox again. We're back to this procession of the equinox, which invades all of these stories and all of these mythologies. And we have a pretty good idea of that from Arthurian legend, because in my fourth book in that series, The Grail Cipher, I connect Arthurian legend up with the gospel story, because there are many links between the two. I mean, for instance, the big hero of Arthurian legend is Joseph of Arimathea, who is a first century character from Judea. So you can see the links. But when Arthur was born, he was born, and to signify his birth, there was a comet which had two rays. One ray indicated the birth of Arthur, and the second ray, the birth of Guinevere. And at the same time, we had the start of the line of the Fisher Kings. And we also have the conundrum that the father of Arthur was called Pendragon. But he wasn't called Pendragon, because if you look at the original Welsh and the original Latin manuscripts from the 12th century, They don't say Pendragon at all. They say Ben-dragon. Not Welsh. This is Hebrew Aramaic. Ben-dragon in Hebrew means the fish. Sorry, son of the fish. Ben-dragon, son of the fish. And of course, we end up with this Arthurian line of fisher kings. What is this talking about? It's talking about the constellation of Pisces, of course. Because if you look at the constellation of Pisces, it has two rays. It is as it were, a comet with two rays that go out with a fish on each end. And if you look at the Dendera zodiac in Egypt, these rays end up with Isis and Horus. Instead of Arthur and Guinevere, they end up with images, little symbols of Isis and Horus. It's the same symbolism that Pisces symbolized the birth of a brother-sister or a mother-son combination, which is exactly what Arthurian history describes. Okay, so if we come back to the birth of the Jesus character, who I equate with this Arthurian story as well, the star that signified his birth would be the same constellation. It would be the appearance of Pisces. So what is this talking about? It's talking about the change between the great month of Aries and the great month of Pisces, which is a real event that you can actually have a look on any planisphere or astrolabe, and it will show you, if you've got a processional one, it will show you the precession of the equinox, and it will show you Aries fading in the dawn sky at the vernal equinox and being replaced with Pisces, the great month of Pisces. And that happened in AD 10. And so the Jesus character, the John the Baptist and the Jesus character and the Arthurian character were the first of the fisher kings. That's why Jesus was born as a lamb of God under Aries, but became a fisher of men, Pisces, because he was the first of the fisher kings. And so the star symbolism that they were talking about for the birth of Jesus was the new constellation of Pisces, which happened in AD 10. A very significant event in the heavens above when one great month changed to another.
Fascinating. So, was Jesus born in April or May?
Well, it doesn't tell you the date he was born. Obviously, under classical theology, he was born on December the 25th. And so again, we have this cosmology, because Jesus was born on the winter solstice, and John the Baptist was born on the summer solstice. He was born 6 months prior. And so they're both marking significant points within the zodiac. But when he was actually born, we don't know. Obviously, that's symbolic, but we don't have any idea when he was actually born.
Okay. The Jesus and James belief system.
Yeah, so you have to understand, because it's not taught very well within Sunday school, or even if you go to a seminary, that Jesus and James were Nazarene. And they'll deny this quite vehemently, even though it specifically says in the New Testament that Jesus was a Nazarene. They try and fob this off on a fictitious place called Nazareth, which didn't exist in the first century. But it's quite clear that he was a Nazarene, because was it Peter or was it Paul? I think it was Paul later on. Yeah, it was Paul, who was said to be a troublemaker of the Nazarene sect. And it specifically says the Nazarene sect as a sect of Judaism. And the Nazarene came from Nazarites, because, and again, they will deny this and say, oh, no, they're two different sects. No, it was the same. The Nazarites became the Nazarene because the name means the same. It means to separate. And that probably means to separate as in like a monastery or a monk or something of that nature, to separate yourself off from society. And Jesus was a Nazarene, and if he was connected with the Odessan monarchy, which I say he was one of the Odessan monarchy, again, he would have been a Nazarene, because the Queen of Odessa, who is called Queen Helena, she became a Nazarene Jew in the AD 50s, and she became the Queen of Judea, and she went through 7 years of initiation, according to the Talmud, to become a Nazarene Jew. And this wasn't the same as Orthodox Judaism. So I call it Egypto-Judaism because it still had a lot of Egyptian influences, because they venerated the zodiac. And again, if you talk to anyone within Judaism or Christianity, they'll say, no, has nothing to do with Judaism. But at least 7 synagogues now have been discovered in Judea and Jordan with a zodiac on the floor, a large zodiac. So even the latest one that I talk about at Hakok, they've now uncovered a large zodiac on the floor at the Hakok mosaic, which again is another synagogue. So there were a lot of these influences from elsewhere, from Egypt, even I suppose from Greece, but then Egypt was Greek at that time anyway. So again, it comes from Egypt. We have the big zodiac at Dendera, which in Egypt, of course, which is the same as the Hamat zodiac on the Sea of Galilee. And the central element on the Hamat zodiac, which is a Nazarene Jewish zodiac, the central element is Helios. Now, under Orthodox Judaism, that would be taboo. That would be forbidden. That's haram. You're not allowed to have graven images of a god, the sun god, sitting in the middle of your zodiac, which is covered in animals, which are also graven images, which you're not allowed to have. And so we know that this was a very different sect of Judaism. In fact, we have an account from Josephus Flavius himself, where Josephus Flavius was sent to Galilee to destroy the Hamat zodiac, which is why we know it's a 1st century zodiac, because he says he was sent there to destroy the images of animals on this zodiac. So yeah, that was Nazarene Judaism. It was different to Orthodox 1st century Judaism, and very different to modern rabbinic Judaism. Very different indeed.
And just going back to what we were talking about a few moments ago with Jesus and birth dates, it reminded me of the quote from John 3:26. John the Baptist, he must increase, but I must decrease, which is an obvious.
Yes,
it's pretty obvious, that one, isn't it?
Yes, it is. We're talking about the cosmos again, the movements of the heavens above.
And so he would be referring there, obviously, to the 2 solstices, wouldn't he?
Yes, as one increases, the other decreases. The sun would be in the far north during the summer solstice, and in the far south during the winter solstice, which was the birth of Jesus. So yeah, that's what it was talking about. But you have to read between the lines, and of course nobody within theology wants to read between the lines properly and see the original astrotheology that was at the foundation of Nazarene Judaism and early Christianity.
And just going back to Jesus and James' belief system, would it be in any way connected to what the Cathars were worshipping or following at the time? Because did they not believe that they were actually worshipping the real religion of Jesus?
Yes. Yeah, the Cathars, if I remember correctly, the name means the pure, were in the south of France, and they had a competing Christianity to the Catholic Church, which the Catholic Church didn't like, because they didn't really require a priesthood or big cathedrals, and so they had a much smaller hierarchy at the top of their religion than the Catholic Church had, so there was not so much wealth within that church. And they venerated Mary Magdalene more than anyone else, which, okay, in Catholicism you can venerate Mary Magdalene, but they did it to a much greater degree, and I think they believed that Mary Magdalene was the wife of Jesus, which again was heretical. And for all of these various heresies, the Catholic Church decided to do away with the Cathars. And so they exterminated them all. So there was a huge, great genocide where the Cathars were all burnt to death. And that's a pogrom that went on for quite some time because it was difficult to find these people. It wasn't as if you could go to a big cathedral and capture them all. They were out there in the countryside, and they had to go around investigating as to whether anybody was a Cathar or not. And so it was over a period of decades, and they exterminated every single Cathar, which is why it doesn't exist today as a religion.
Okay, great. Yeah. At this point, I would just like to remind everyone that we've previously done a video on Ralph's Jesus's books, which is well worth watching. So with that in mind, Ralph, can you talk to us about the Royal Crown of Odessa?
Yeah, so I equate the gospel story with the Kings of Odessa and the Jewish revolt. So again, it's a little known thing because they won't discuss it, that the kings and queens of Odessa became the kings and the queens of Judea in the mid-first century. And so there's this big, strong connection between Odessa and Judea in the mid-first century. And I say that the gospel story is talking about the Jewish revolt, and the Odessans were involved in the Jewish revolt. The Queen of Odessa, Queen Helena, she had the largest tomb and the largest palace in Jerusalem. She was the Queen of Judea, the Queen of the Jews. And therefore her son, who was known as King Esus Manu, became the King of the Jews. Familiar title? Yeah. This was a king of the Jews who was called King Esus Manu, King Jesus Emmanuel. Same guy, same name, same story. But one of the other connections we have with the gospel story is that the Odessans wore a traditional crown of thorns. So this is not a crown of thorns as you will see portrayed in any cathedral or church. It wasn't brambles. They use brambles because they're still trying to persuade you that Jesus was a pauper prince of peace. But he wasn't. He was a king, a very wealthy king. And so he had a proper crown of thorns, which was a big domed mitre, a little bit like a pope would wear. And it was covered with spines, thorns. And we don't really know what the thorns were. Lots of people have had guesses, but nobody is quite sure. I wondered if they were feathers, feathers from the fiery phoenix or something of that nature. Not sure why this crown would have thorns all over the top of it. But anyway, they're quite distinctive, and only the Odessans really wear this type of crown. So it was quite unique in the first century. And so when Jesus was crucified wearing a crown of thorns, it was pointing out quite pointedly that he was a king of Odessa, because only they wore a crown of thorns. So quite obviously this gospel story was talking about the Odessan royal family and the siege of Jerusalem, the Jewish revolt in AD 66 to AD 70. And that's the top book, Jesus, King of Odessa, where I finally found out who the Jesus character was, because I've been searching for him for the previous 25 years before that. And, you know, I'd realized, of course, that he was a real king and he wasn't a pauper prince of peace. I knew he was connected with the story in Josephus Flavius about Jesus there in his story of the Jewish revolt, because one of the leaders of the Jewish revolt was called Jesus. I'd made all of those connections, but even then I had still not seen the connection with Odessa. And it wasn't until I started investigating Odessa that I suddenly saw where this royal family came from. And yeah, it's an interesting story. Interesting.
It's an incredible story, Ralph. And yeah, I highly encourage everyone to go out and read the books. Can you talk on the multiple names of Jesus as well?
Yes, one of the big criticisms I've had about my Odessa theory is that Jesus ends up with a number of hyperchorisms or nicknames. But of course he had to, because Odessa was persona non grata, you might say. It was the heretical royal family and the heretical city that its name dare not be mentioned by anybody. And we know this because if you go through the works of Josephus or even the Roman historians and you look for Odessa, it'll say nothing found. If you look for King Abgarus, King Manu, King Esus, it'll say nothing found. And so this royal family has been deleted from history. They were forbidden. Rome didn't want you to know about them because this was the royal family who had started a revolt against Rome. And the last thing Rome wanted was the glorification of this rebel royal family. And so they were banned. They were deleted from history. And so if you wanted to talk about this royal family, and of course they were an important part of the first century, and especially the Jewish revolt era, you had to invent a pseudonym. That was just the way it had to be. And many pseudonyms were invented, but they all have a rationale behind them. There's no point having a pseudonym where you just make up a nonsense name, because nobody will know what you're talking about. It has to have some link back to the real people that you're talking about. And one of the common ways of doing that was by calling these people locusts. Because to the Jews, the classical Jews down in Jerusalem, and to the Romans, these people were no better than the locusts of the plagues from the Old Testament. So the locusts came out of the east and they destroyed Egypt during the plagues and forced the Jews, the Israelites, onto an exodus. And what they were saying is the Odessan royal family were the same. They were no better than locusts because they had come out of the east into Syria and Judea. They had caused the Jewish revolt against Rome, and they had lost the revolt and forced the exile of the Jews from Judea. So they were no better than locusts. And so you'll find these people being called locusts all the time. So in classical history, they will call them Arabs, presumably because they think they came from the east, but they weren't Arabs. They were Jews from Persia. They were Egypto-Jews from Persia, nothing to do with Arabs. But they called them Arabs because Arab can mean, if you slightly mispronounce it, it can mean locust in Aramaic. And they called these people Agabus. He's called that in the Acts of the Apostles. So instead of Abgarus, they called him Agabus. Why? Because Agabus means the locust. And then in the Talmud, Again, they couldn't mention his name, so they call him Bar Kamsa, because Kamsa means a locust. And so anyone who knows this and knows how to translate a little bit of Aramaic or Hebrew will know who you're talking about. So you can keep it secret in plain sight, which was the main goal of this little game. And then Josephus himself, he calls them the kings and the princes of Adiabeni, which is a fictitious place that doesn't exist. There is no archaeology that can pinpoint where this Adiabeni place is supposed to be. But we know where Adiabeni really is, because the queen of Adiabeni was Queen Helena, and she was married to King Abgarus, who was the king of Odessa. So now we know where Adiabeni is. It is Odessa. And so basically what we've ended up with is a whole series of pseudonyms, because no one dare mention the name of this particular royal family. You would either be persecuted by the Romans, because they were the first people who banned the naming of this royal family, because they had started the revolt, and Rome didn't want to praise or talk about someone that had didn't want to glorify the name, is a better way of putting it, of a royal family that had started a revolt against Rome. And later on, this name was banned by the Catholic Church, because they knew of the connection between this royal family and the gospel story. And so the last thing that they wanted is for you to be talking about the Odessan royal family in relation to the Gospels. And so again, the name was banned and you couldn't actually talk about it. And so, yeah, they are the non-royal family from the non-principality that nobody could mention.
Amazing stuff. If I was to say the Roman Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Nazarene, you know what I'm talking about. Star Wars in Judea.
Yes, and people get upset by this. I don't know why. I think it's just opposition for opposition's sake sometimes. I don't know. It seemed obvious to me a long, long time ago that the Star Wars story was talking about Judea and the Jewish revolt, the same topic that comes up time and time again in all of these histories, and that someone had remastered the Jewish revolt for a new audience in a modern era and cast it into a battle across the cosmos instead of a battle across Judea. And so, we have the Jedi, who are the Judai, effectively. And really, they are the Essene, because the Essene used to travel across Judea, and they were specifically told they don't need to carry any belongings. All they needed was a cloak and a staff, sometimes a sword. And what do the Jedi carry? Well, they have a cloak and a lightsaber, and they seem to, march across the galaxy without any particular belongings, exactly the same as the Essene used to do, protected by their mysterious force. May the force be with you. And so you have these connections, but I didn't really see the full connections until a later episode, and I forget which episode it is. But anyway, they had this the original fortress of the Jedi, which was called Jeddah. I forget on which moon it was supposed to be based, and it was destroyed by a couple of huge, great cruisers came along and destroyed the place. But if you look at Jeddah, the city and the temple of the Jedi, it's Masada. It's exactly the same as Masada, which is the natural fortress that the Jews retreated to after the Jewish revolt. So when the Jewish revolt ended in AD 70, some of the Sicarii especially, so the real troublemakers, ran down to Masada, and they had a last stand at Masada, which lasted about 3 years, I think, with the Romans camped all around the base, trying to destroy Masada, and they all committed suicide because there was no way out and the Romans were about to break in. But if you look at Masada, it's exactly the same as Jeddah within the Star Wars story. And so, I mean, that just shows you exactly what the Star Wars story was all about. So the evil empire in Star Wars is the Roman Empire. And the plucky rebels who are trying to stand up against the evil empire are the plucky rebel Nazarene Jews who are trying to stand up to the Romans in the 1st century in Judea, with their mysterious force that was going to help them. It's the same story, and it's quite obvious that someone has recast the Jewish revolt into the modern era and retold that story so it stays within the memory, the sort of cultural memory of the people. It's the same story. And then, of course, I had to go on and say who the characters were. And the characters are not easy to discern. But one of them that is fairly obvious is who was the Jedi who went to the other side and sold himself to the evil empire? It's Josephus Flavius. He was the member of the rebels before he had a flash of inspiration and on the road to Japata, and went over to the Romans and became a Roman. He's the traitor, the very well known, very hated traitor of the Jews who went over to the Romans and became a Roman commander in the Roman army. The links are indisputable.
Fantastic. Okay, next one. Apologies for going a bit into Da Vinci Code mode here, but did Jesus and Mary have a child?
Yes, they had several children. Yes, they got married. Of course they did. Jesus was a rabbi. You can't really be a rabbi unless you have a wife. It was obligatory. And he became, if he was the character who I say he was, who's sometimes called Jesus of Gamala, then he needed 2 wives because he became the high priest of Jerusalem, and the high priest required 2 wives. And the nature of his wives is given to us by the Talmud. And the Talmud tells us that Jesus of Gamala married Mary Magdalene. And so we have Jesus and Mary as a known husband and wife. But the real problem, I think, for the Catholic Church is not so much the marriage, I don't think. It's because, A, he married 2 sisters, Mary and Martha, the Bethany sisters, who were the daughters of Simon Boethus. That's why they lived at the house of Simon. But also that Mary was most probably his half-sister. And we sort of know this because this was a tradition within the pharaonic royal line that they all married within the family. Cleopatra married both of her brothers. King Agrippa II married his sister, Berenike, and Jesus would have married his sister as well. And I think she was probably a half-sister because I think she was much younger than the Jesus character. But Mary Magdalene would have married Jesus, and of course they would have had children. And one of their children would have been Sarah, of course, Sarah meaning princess, who traveled with Mary Magdalene to southern France. We also get a vague link to a possible son of Jesus within Arthurian legend, because they have a king of Palmyra who is identified, and it's a very clever identification. I can't really go through it just talking about it here because it's too complex, but it's a very clever link, a Pesha-style link between the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians and the destruction of Jerusalem during the Jewish revolt. Now, the king who destroyed Jerusalem was Nebuchadnezzar, 6th century BC. The second king who destroyed Jerusalem was the Jesus character, the King of Odessa, when the Jewish revolt failed and Jerusalem was destroyed. And basically what it's saying is that the son of a person who destroyed Jerusalem was the king of Palmyra in the 1st century. And so who was the son of the person who had just destroyed Jerusalem? It was the son of the Jesus character, the son of the King of Odessa, who I say was the Jesus character. And he was the king of Palmyra, or the prince of Palmyra, you might say, in the 1st century. And he becomes important in the story because they want to know what the intentions of Palmyra was, because it was quite obvious that the Palmyrans hadn't really joined in this Jewish revolt business because they probably knew the power of Rome, and it was probably a futile effort to go and oppose Rome. And so they'd stayed out of the revolt. And of course, Rome wanted to know what they were going to do. Were they going to try and generate a second revolt, or were they going to disarm? And so that was of prime interest to Emperor Vespasian when he became the Emperor of Rome.
Fascinating. Okay, we're getting close to the end of this section now. The next one I've got lined is one I haven't actually come across on Facebook before, but when I saw the title, I had to ask you about this. Mary Magdalene in Devon.
Oh, yes. Yeah, this is... there's not much evidence on this. This is just a connection I saw between Odessa and the Earls of Devon. Odessa was liberated from Muslim control by the Counts of Boulogne in 1098, so during the First Crusade. So we have this strange, I've talked about this before, but we have this strange event where the First Crusade did not go to Jerusalem, where you might expect it to go to. Didn't go to Judea, where you might expect it to go to. The First Crusade went to Odessa, that central place that keeps coming up in this story. So the first city to be liberated from Muslim control and oppression in the late 12th century, late 11th century, it was 1098, wasn't it, was Odessa. And why did they go to Odessa? Well, they must have known something about Odessa. So the Counts of Boulogne must have known that Odessa was central to this gospel story. And that's why they went there, because they were looking for secrets. And that's probably what they found. That's why we had the Knights Templar being formed, because they were formed as a body that could contain secrets through its initiations to actually join the Knights Templar. So the Counts of Boulogne must have known about Odessa and were probably related in some fashion, although we don't know how, to the original Odessan royal family. Possibly because Mary Magdalene had fled to France and had been living in France and so on. And so there are possible links there. But then I noted that the Counts of Boulogne have the same coat of arms as the coat of arms of Odessa. And that was interesting, but it turned out that the coat of arms went from Boulogne to Odessa, not from Odessa to Boulogne. And so they have the same coat symbolism. They have the same coat of arms, the three the three red tarts, they call it. And this is tarts of the cooking variety, not of the streetwalker variety. And then later on, of course, I was searching into this, and it turns out that that was not the coat of arms of Boulogne. It was actually the coat of arms of Courtenay, which is interesting because that's the same name as the Prince of Orange, where I say Mary Magdalene went to. He was known as Courtenay, William or Guillaume de Courtenay, who came from Orange, which is in the south of France, which is where I say Mary Magdalene went to. You'll have to read this in my book, Mary Magdalene, the Princess of Orange, because it's a little bit complex. But anyway, so we ended up with this coat of arms coming from Courtenay, which again is in central northern France. And the Courtenay family gave their coat of arms to the Counts of Boulogne, which is how it ended up in Odessa. And the coat of arms of Orange in the south of France is the same. They have the same symbolism in Orange in the south of France. But then the Courtenays were kicked out of the country, as these aristocratic families often are. They have this wonderful place at the pinnacle of society, but they're often kicked around by other people with, slightly more power than they've got. And they were kicked out of France, and they ended up in Devon. So the Earls of Devon, the Counts and the Earls of Devon in southern Britain, have the same coat of arms as Boulogne and Odessa and Orange in the south of France. So there you go. It was just an interesting, and they've been there ever since, of course. So they were kicked out of, I'm just wondering when this was. They were kicked out of France in something like the 15th century or something. So a long time ago. Anyway, and they ended up in southern Britain, in Devon. And so, yeah, the Counts or the Earls of Devon have the same coat of arms as Odessa. Connections and connections everywhere you go.
Fascinating. Small world, isn't it?
It is,
yes. Yeah. So let's conclude this section with the tomb of Jesus and Arthur of Stonehenge.
Yes. Well, that's an interesting little story, isn't it? Of course, we don't know where Jesus was buried. I have this theory, and again, it's circumstantial evidence, but if you connect the Jesus character in the gospel story with the Kings of Odessa, the Kings of Odessa were exiled after the Jewish revolt failed and ended. And they were taken to Rome to be thrown into a Roman prison. And we don't know what happened to them. But what we do know is that Emperor Vespasian, the person who actually took them to Rome, built a prison fortress over in Chester in England, which was as far as you could possibly get from Judea within the Roman Empire. So if you wanted to separate any dangerous rebels from their place of power, then Chester in what is now England would be the best place to put them. And they built this prison fortress. That's all it can be described as, in Chester. And I think it was to house the rebels from the Jewish revolt. So for many reasons, it was worth their while not executing these people, because what Rome didn't want to do is they didn't want to start another revolt on the eastern borders of the Roman Empire. These people were defeated, but still powerful, and they were linked to the Parthian royal family as well. So if you're going to kill someone like the Odessan king and the Odessan princes, who are very closely related to the Parthian Empire over in Parthia, Persia, you're going to upset the Parthians as well. And the last thing that Rome wanted to do was upset the Parthians, because the Rome had already lost 3 armies to the Parthians. They were the sort of mortal enemy of Rome. So the last thing Rome wanted to do was upset the Parthians by killing these captured Odessan kings and princes. Okay, so what to do with them? Okay, well, let's just throw them into a 1st century Guantanamo Bay, a prison fortress, which was as far from Judea as you could possibly get within the Roman Empire. And that's where I think they went to. And there's many good reasons for thinking so. And then we get to an even more tenuous piece of history, because again, it comes from Arthurian legend. If we link up the Arthurian story with the gospel story, as I have done in my Grail cipher book, and there's many good reasons for doing so, then where was King Arthur buried? Well, actually, we don't know, but what we do know is that his father and his son were both buried at Stonehenge. So the story goes. And, well, if you think about it, that might actually be a reasonable place to place an Arthurian Jesus-type character. You don't want their remains, their mortal remains, going back to Judea, where they could be the centerpiece for a new revolt against Rome. You don't want that to happen, but you need to give this burial some sort of dignity, because this guy was powerful. He's got powerful friends back in the Roman East and also in Parthia. You need some sort of decent burial. Well, how about Stonehenge? Because it was vacant at the time. It was abandoned. It hadn't been in use ever since the Druids were. I'm just thinking for a minute. When were the Druids were destroyed, if I remember correctly, in AD 64-ish. So not long before the Jewish revolt, the Romans had the revolt of the Druids, and the destruction of a Roman legion and civilization, I suppose, when they had the uprising of the Iceni, which was quite obviously connected with the destruction of the Druids. So the destruction of the Druids happened up in Anglesey, which is up on the northwest coast. But immediately after that, the Iceni in the east of England revolted against Rome and caused massive destruction. They destroyed Camalodunum, and they destroyed London and various other places, St. Albans. They were all burnt to the ground. So Rome already knew the perils of destroying a particular people, the Druids. It caused this massive uprising and revolt in Britain, which cost the Romans dearly, destroyed a lot of their infrastructure. That was another good reason for being a little bit more lenient when they came to this Odessan people who had started the revolt in the east. The last thing Rome wanted was to upset the Roman East and cause another uprising and another revolt. And so that's another reason why I think these rebels were sent into this prison fortress in the northwest of England. But of course, because the Druids had already been destroyed in AD 64, or it was 63 or 64, Stonehenge would have been abandoned. It would have been empty. And it lay on a Roman road. It was a very significant artifact, old temple, sitting on a Roman road. What better place you could use to bury some sort of important rebel king that you wanted to quietly forget about? Bury them at Stonehenge, and that's what Arthurian legend says. And of course, we wouldn't know if someone had been buried there because we haven't investigated all of Stonehenge. So there's been various investigations in and around Stonehenge. But for instance, we've never lifted the central trilithon, which has been lying on the ground for at least a couple of thousand years. So nobody knows what's under the fallen trilithon. So yeah, all speculation, of course. We don't know, but it makes sense, and it would suit the history of the era to bury someone at Stonehenge.